Welcome along. In front of me here you can see a couple of completed Triumph tanks, and what we're going to do in this video series is go through a bit of a step-by-step process of how we achieve this result here, starting with bare metal and going right the way up to the top coat as you can see it from here. Hopefully you find that this video is informative as well as enjoy it. Just to put a bit of context, this is a little bit of a simplified process that we're looking at, where we have your bare metal, you have your 2-pack epoxy primer combined with your repair, then your priming stage, and then your top coat stage. But we will be breaking each of these down, but just to put it into your mind, that's the process that we are taking in this segment. There is other ways, like this way here, but a lot of it can be derived by product and what type of product. So we are covering it in this way first in this video, so hopefully it will help make sense along the way. Before we get started, I thought I'd cover something a little bit first, before secondly moving on to some product information. Now, secondly, primer ain't primer. That's a saying that we have, which essentially means not all product is the same. So quality, application and uses will vary from product to product and manufacturer to manufacturer. So don't ignore reading those technical data sheets, and don't take my word for it either, read through them. Even guidelines on equipment, on when to use, say for instance, one of these. Yes, sure, when you connect it up it can make a bit of a sound, but we do have to look after our health. And for those of you that don't have the time to follow up on a lot of these things, someone passed on to me some helpful information, and with it, you shouldn't go wrong. And that is, if you always... hopefully you found that as helpful as I did. But if you found that a little bit difficult to understand, just refer to those technical data sheets. So bare metal is what we're looking at today, and it's important to seal this bare metal off with 2-pack epoxy etch. So whether you're dealing with a couple of bike parts or a front fender, it's very important to seal it off with some kind of rust preventative measure. And we're looking at 2-pack epoxy etch, as I said. So whether it's been blasted, it's very important to get that on straight away. Otherwise, if you're doing a chemical strip, whether it be paint stripper or you're sanding it, you will often find you get a bit of flash rust. So we will go through a bit of metal conditioning before we 2-pack epoxy etch. I won't be going through any of the sanding on how to do it. It's quite technical, and often a lot of technical language is used, like 4-letter words and 5-letter words. But if you want to give it a go yourself, you can. You probably will pick up on the 4-letter and 5-letter words, but I'll leave that to your discretion, or otherwise get someone professionally to strip it. Otherwise, going back to the 2-pack epoxy etch, we're going to be looking at the metal conditioner, putting that on before we put the epoxy etch on there, just to get rid of that flash rust. So a bit of surface rust here. We're not going to be keying any of this, I'm just trying to show you what you're looking at doing. Don't forget glasses, gloves, scouring pad, and I'm using some metal conditioner here. Just do look at the technical data sheets on the metal conditioners, because some of them tell you one thing, like as far as how long you're supposed to use it and how you're supposed to let it not dry, etc. So always look at it first. So you can see it's starting to dissipate. Often pays just to leave it on there for a few moments just to get rid of that initial surface rust and get a bit of chemical strip, and then we're good to go from there. You don't really want to let any of the metal conditioner dry on there, so we are just going to now wipe it off. I've wiped it off dry, but you do need to look at the technical data sheets, as I said. So sometimes a damp cloth is another way to go. So you can see I'm using gloves, so don't want to get any of my greasy, grubby, grimy hands on there. What you don't need to do is you don't need to worry about any of these little dents. I will just grind that off in a second. Don't worry about any dents at the moment. At this stage, we'll be putting a 2-pack epoxy etch straight over those. We thought we'd do a bit of commentary. Well, I thought, because there's sometimes some information that we like to discuss that you won't, well, you miss out on if we just talk through a process. So I have Jared here with me.
Hello.
And I think at this stage we're just using a bit of metal prep. You can use a bit of wax and grease remover just to help clean the surface down a little bit, especially if you've got grubby hands. And I'm going to be putting down 2 coats of epoxy edge, I believe in this case. But you do come across a few little dents, don't you, Jared? And you just don't know whether to put a body filler on first or not.
Well, that's it. It's always depending on the context, but if you're doing a full resto, then it's always good to get blasted and epoxy prime first, and then see where you're at. If you're just doing small or dents on your car, it's always good to use a hammer and dolly and try and get the worst of it out first, then put your epoxy primer on. Or if it's small enough, then yeah, it's epoxy primer and then do your repairs.
That's the problem with a lot of the stuff. Once you strip it down, you don't know what's underneath. You've got rust. I guess that's where you're sealing it all off once you've blasted it or stripped it down and metal prepped it. You're sealing off with epoxy edge before having to grind down any repairs later on. So just trying to work little stages at a time. Having applied several coats of my epoxy primer, I've left this one overnight. However, if you're using a booth and you want to bake it, just check your technical data sheets. Just to give you an overview of the next part that we're looking at some of the repairs, so we'll come in closer in a second. We're looking for any dents that we need to sand back and use a fine filler. And if there's any bare metal that we happen to expose, we'll need to re-put our epoxy primer over the top of that before going on to the priming stage. So come in closer and let's have a look. So this tank has a few marks on there. I did choose this epoxy primer because it does have a fair bit of fill. We'll be sanding this down with 240, and if there's any repairs that need to be done, we'll be using a bit of knifing putty over the top of those repairs. Alright, so this is a different tank, and we haven't really had our morning coffee, so pardons, but we've gone through this tank and we've circled with, circled the damage with a water-based crayon.
Yeah, you just want to stick away from using like pens or permanent markers because they can bleed through and it will show through your paint as well.
Yeah, I've seen a few of those jobs, and I think we then go into this repair here where we're using a bit of 120 to key in the surface.
Yeah, so you just key it in, which technically just means you're sanding it just to give your body filler something to adhese to, or it will just it won't stick to a smooth surface.
Well, that's the other reason why we also blow that surface out as well with a bit of a blower.
Yeah, so you want to blow it out before you put your body filler in, just to get rid of all the dust, because yeah, if you put your body filler on dust, it might not stick, or you're going to get like pull dragging through your body filler.
And it balls up and it'll come out in your work. And then, so you're using a bit of knifing putty here. You've got a golf ball size to a pea size, but it does say on the side anyway, I think this is a 2%, but otherwise that's the kind of size.
Yeah, and we're just using a fine filler for this dent because it's just a small repair, but if you've got bigger repairs, you just want to check the label on your body filler. It will say more like medium to deeper depth sort of fillers, so just make sure you get the right one.
And look at you fold that body filler like a professional.
Yeah, so you want to fold it with a bit of pressure just to try and get rid of all the air pockets in there, just so it's just nice and smooth.
So don't stir it.
Don't stir it, it's not cement. And you just want to make sure you use nice, clean bog knives.
Yeah, and then a nice smooth application. Although we do call it a skim, don't we?
Yeah, so it's just call it a nice tight skim. And what you want to do is just put it in nice and smooth, nice and tight, and put a bit of pressure on the sides of the blade, just around like smooth off the edges, because you just don't want big thick edges because it's just going to take a lot longer to sand.
Takes practice, of course.
Yeah.
Before we proceed any further, let's talk a little bit about guide coating. Guide coating can come in an aerosol. A lot of people prefer to use matte black. It's not too bad to sand. Otherwise, it does come, I believe, in a powdered version. Otherwise, there is the powder version here. But I like to use, personally speaking, the aerosol at this stage in the game where it's coming to identify any highs and lows in a panel that are in need of repair. So at the epoxy primer stage, I use it a lot. And when I'm using it sometimes to identify a smaller dent at the priming stage. Whereas the powdered version, I normally use that at the priming stage to help identify any scratch marks that might be left over from a repair. So that way I can see it a lot easier before I put my top coat on. So going into the guide coating here, I think in this case I used a bit of matte black in an aerosol rather than powdered guide coat. and spraying it on lightly, ever so lightly. No, the joke's never going to take on. And even in this case here. And the idea of the guide coat when you start sanding it is to reveal the highs and lows and then deal with those low parts, whether you're using knifing putty or something like that. And you can see I'm using a bit of 240 dry here with a firm block, not so much a flexi block, and sanding away. And you can see me removing the black there just to reveal the low parts and the highs and lows there.
Where?
Yeah, come on. Yeah, there. You can see it. Right. Oh, look, I even pointed out for you. Yeah, so where I'm pointing out now.
You can see that high spot there.
Yeah, the little bit of a high spot and low spot. We did have to use a bit of knifing putty in the bottom right-hand side just to fill that up. And, yeah.
Yeah, looks like your sand strokes are a bit all over the place. One nice long stroke. Oh, yeah.
There we go.
There we go.
Yeah. And following the curve of the panel, that's important. You've got to follow the curve of the panel. Yeah. Now, I did put a little joke in here where I was sanding in the bottom left there is a little bit of black. Yeah, don't get into it with your sandpaper and just go, yeah, sand, look, black's gone, the low's gone. Nah, no, that's not going to work, yeah. So just don't do that. Now, once the body filler is cured, you're using a bit of 120 just to take the tips off the body filler. Now, you were covering something a second ago about the body filler application.
Yeah, you just want to make sure you get it in there nice and smooth so you don't have big, thick edges. So obviously the nicer you put it in, the easier it is to sand.
And you don't want to fill it in one go. You probably might need to do it several times, so don't expect
Yeah, that's right. Depending on the depth of the dent, sometimes it's easier just to give it a little bit of fill in the worst part and then reapply, do a tight skim over the top, just like a nice thin skim over the top. Just not trying to get it all done in one. Sometimes it's better to do it in layers.
Yeah. And I think we're now on 180 grit now. You might have just saw a few seconds ago with a body filler just taking just the tips off, not trying to work with it. And I see that you're on that part there, you saw just using your fingers over the top. Just explain that a little bit for me.
Yeah, so you just want to keep feeling your work as you go, just so you can pick up any highs and lows. So generally you want to use your whole hand and fill the whole panel with the curvatures and all, depending on which panel you're working on. But yeah, you want to feel past the repair as well.
Right now, yeah.
Yeah, and so you'll feel it on your whole fingers and
flats of your fingers.
Yeah, just not your fingertips. You need to use your whole hand.
Yeah, so far I haven't done any speeding up of the video, as I really wanted you guys to get a sense of how long it does take to do a repair or using body filler and sanding it down. So at least I hope that you appreciate some of the time it takes, and as well hopefully pick up on some of the commentary on a few things that can help. Well, you're working pretty quick there. It looks like you're about to start a fire.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, look, you've got to be careful when you're using things like orbital sanders, especially on like large panels like doors, bonnets and things like that.
Thin metal too.
Yeah, it's thinner metal, so you just got to be careful because it can swell up your metal or warp your metal by using machines, because it does generate a lot of heat.
Yeah, a motorbike tank has more structure, so you probably can get away with a bit more though. So you can see that we did blow out the dust from the body filler there, just to clear it out to check for any pinholes.
Yeah, you really want to dress your pinholes before you put your primer down, so if there is any, just knife them up and just get them done.
You can see we just pointed out a bit of bare metal there, and we're having to put the 2-pack epoxy primer over that area there. And people might get a bit upsetty spaghetti. You can see me just sanding quickly over the top with a bit of 240, just to give the epoxy primer something to stick to for the bare metal, and just doing that little repair there. So again, blowing it out, because you really got to check for those pinholes or any areas, which you would have dealt with if you had a bit of guide coat over the top of that. And it's a good way of actually checking for pinholes. Otherwise, then putting on your 2-pack epoxy primer over the bare metal just to seal that off before we're going into the priming stage. Quick summary of the 2-pack epoxy primer. As you can see, these tanks are all done. Just a summary of this one here. We had any of the repairs that were done. We had to, of course, put a bit of the 2-pack epoxy primer back over the bare metal, and the repairs have all been done. We had a bit of a close look at this, and we did find a bit of a pinhole underneath here. So we did have to weld that back up there,
and then run a bit of tank sealer through there. But outside of that, the next stage is the priming stage. So we're going to give it a bit of a key down with a 240 dry or 320 dry before putting the primer down.
It would have been nice to have a few different repairs to show you, but each repair is quite unique.
Yeah, every dent's going to be different to each other, so it's always hard to try and film each one.
Yeah, because they are quite unique. And I was going to say before that when you have any bare metal exposed, okay, seal it off with the epoxy primer, but if you just have your body filler that you've happened to shape out and there's no exposed bare metal, you can just put your primer straight on top of that. And there are cases where we just do that because there's no bare metal exposed, so there's no risk of rust and things like that.
Yeah, and ideally you want to get all your repairs done before you put your two-pack primer down, but if you need to, you can put body filler over the top of two-pack primer.
Yeah, knifing putty, yeah. We're back into the booth here, just giving a little tack cloth down and blowing it down. This tank was an aubergine one, and maybe I'll put a little clip at the end on how this job worked out. It worked out quite well, but otherwise just tack clothing it down. I'm using I like to use a primer more on a surfacer or a slight fill rather than a primer filler, because I find sanding the primer later easier to sand, otherwise you can produce a lot more orange peel. But otherwise, hopefully you can see in real time the distance and speed I'm putting down the primer. And yes, I'm working fairly quickly, but I've got a lot of primer going out. And it does dry to a nice little satin finish, but you can see it going on, look like wet. It looks almost like black, gloss black paint.
Yeah, it goes on nice and smooth. Makes it a lot easier to sand.
So that, not all primers are like that, but you can see it's going nice and even. And I do invest in a good primer gun so I can get nice finer atomization and going on smooth rather than a heavy droplet. And then once that goes off, I think I put down 3 coats down of the primer and allowing it about, I think the degrees was about 28 degrees in the booth, and allowed about 5 minutes. And so you can see right now it's dried off to this satin finish and it's ready for its next coat.
And you're using the appropriate value shade to the colour you're putting on.
Yeah, that's a good point. So in this case, this was a very dark aubergine, so almost like an eggplant colour. So I had to use a black primer. So really, before you put primer down, it's probably a good idea to check out what colour primer you've got to do. I think I've got another video. I might insert this up in the top corner using the right value shade of primer.
The tank has all been primed. This welded seam here normally has a bit of a chrome strip that goes over the top of it, but the customer changed his mind at the last and we had to sand back, as you can see, sand back this ridge here, put a bit of knifing putty in here, and then sand it back over the top. So your knifing putties can go over the top of primer, and once we are happy with that, we just spot prime that back up. Now I'll just show you a few things what you're looking for when it comes down to sanding. You can see here that the tank has been sanded. This is what we're wanting. Whereas here, you would find that there's a lot of little dark spots. Now, you would normally use guide coat, whether it be powder or like a matte black, to be able to reveal these highs and lows. But unfortunately, you won't be able to see it. But you'll find that when you sand it, you get this light grey. So because we're doing a black primer, we won't be using guide coat, but this is what we want to do. We're using a combination of several blocks, something like flexi block, something a bit more firm to get this result here. We're using 400, might drop to 320 to get a finish, but I'll be finishing on about 600 dry, or the equivalent is about 800 wet and dry. And that's what I'll be finishing the tank with.
So just to reiterate, I believe I'm using 400 grit dry. If I'm using 320, that's fine. It's just to take the tips off initially. You don't want to go to too fine a grit too quickly, otherwise you can just round out those orange peel effects that's left over by the primer. So you really want to get that nice and sanding. I know it looks like a lot of work, and yes, you're right, it is. It's about the prep work. It's what is it? What is the saying I keep saying? No, I forgot my own saying. It's faster to eat the food than it is to prepare it. So just painting doesn't take as long as the preparation. But you can see it's hard to tell the curvature of the tank, so you don't know what quiet I'm doing via a video, whereas in reality you might see all the little divots and the dents and things like that.
Yeah, and you're following the shape of the curvatures, following the shape of any sort of kicks and lines. You don't want to sand too hard, you want to follow the shape of the panel.
You notice that I did swap a block then. I went from a firm block to a blue block there, which is a more, well, still firm, but it's flexible for doing the curves.
Yeah, you just want to make sure your blocks are nice and flat on the bottom, like on the surface. You don't want blocks that are twisted, or your work's going to come out all wavy and warpy.
You do get what you pay for when it comes to blocks. And even here, I know some people might go, oh, well, I'm using my hands. Look, we have come up with our own creations with our own blocks that suit a certain idea or a certain shape, but often you have to work with your hands, and this is important, not allowing too much pressure on your fingertips, because you can create little finger grooves. So you do have to have a bit of practice behind you, a bit of knowledge on what you're doing. So I think going too coarse or too fine. And even here, when I've sanded the primer, you can see with the grey, with the black there, how easy it is to see those scratches. So I'm trying to get that out. And then I think we swapped to, yes, we swapped to some wet and dry on the right hand side of the tank, which I'll cover in a second. So using 800 grit wet and dry, and I had sanded the panel with about 600 grit dry paper, and that's what I finished on. And I'm just showing you the difference in a second, the difference between wet and dry paper and dry paper. And at the end of the video, just in case you're not aware, Jared, I will be going through some grey primer and with some guide coating and things like that, so you get a bit of an idea, because we didn't have a chance in this, with this segment of videos to doing any grey primer. We all had black primer because of the colours. Yeah,
I was going to say, and there's benefits, pros and cons of using dry and or wet sanding. Both are good.
Yeah, so on the left there was dry paper there. I finished off in this, I think it's called Aslex, this little soft pad with interchangeable colours sanding paper. Well, otherwise that's equivalent to 600 grit of the soft foam pad there. Whereas on the right hand side was an 800 grit wet and dry. I don't know if you guys can tell a difference, maybe you guys can, but in all honesty, it wasn't any difference really. But the whole idea is you're removing any previous scratches, and I think that's what you're really wanting to do. This part of the demo here, this tank I had sitting up on top of the booth for about 2 years. And shout out to the person, the customer that I got this tank off. If you've got the key to unlock the fuel cap, yeah, I would like it. Otherwise, I had painted so many of these tanks in the last few weeks. I think we were joking around. I said, I reckon I could prime this tank blindfolded, so you can see
pretty good too.
Yeah. Funnily enough, it did, didn't it? So you can see me sanding away with dry paper. So I'm not using any technique. This tank it was just for practice purposes. But you can see I'm just sanding it down just to show you once I put that guide coat down what to actually expect. And it's a little bit different when it comes to grey primers or your lighter colour primers, because you do need your guide coat, whether it be powder or an aerosol form of some sort. And you can see, I'm just going to zoom up here in a second so you can see the differences. You really want that part, you want to get rid of all the black, so you really got to flatten it all out so it's all that smooth grey. So you really got to go over it and get it all nice and flat and smooth. You know what I mean, right, Jared?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully everyone
nice and smooth. You just want to get rid of the orange peel.
Yeah. And also to show you the scratches, which I'll put on in a second. On the right hand side, see how it's nice and sanded, whereas the left hand side you can see all the lows with all the black that you need to get out. Now I swapped over to the dry guide coat. So again, I talked about it before, to reveal the scratch marks. So especially things like silver, if you get a scratch mark in your grey primer, you can't see it, it comes out in your work. So I'm using the wet and dry sandpaper, bit of 800 again, just using the guide coat over the top, and you might have picked up on a scratch or two, but when I wipe it off in a second, or rather smear it everywhere, you can see some scratches. So you can see I'll wipe it out, and you can see these scratches there. Now, if I'd gone over that, it felt smooth, but smelled smooth. It felt smooth, but I couldn't see those scratches. So this is where your powdered guide coat really stand apart.
because it gets into those scratch marks, whereas the aerosol matte black doesn't really get into those scratch marks. So,
and like I said, if you're doing metallics, all that shows.
Oh yeah,
then
so,
you got to start all over again.
Yeah. Well, that's a bit over dramatic, but
That's what
anyway,
it feels like.
Yeah. So you can see when to use the powdered guide coat. Finally, we're up to the color stage. The more exciting things start to happen now, and it comes together. So this is when the projects, or in this case, this project, starting to come together. But let's reiterate a couple of things. If you are doing your own project, hopefully you've seen how long it takes to do even some simple sanding or a little bit of filling. So imagine if you're doing a whole car, it does take time. So it is in the prep work, but we're up to the color now. So let's get a little bit more excited, and we're really starting to see this project come together. But what I will say is, because you've seen how much time it goes into it, really invest in good quality paint. So good quality color that's going to cover quite well, and your clear coats that's going to last. So if you're not sure, come in and see us. But that's one of the things that I will say. So this aubergine is originally a candy, and I decided to modernize it just to make, I like the metallic in it, the creation that we came up with.
Makes it a bit more vibrant.
Yeah.
They're still keeping the original colour.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. And just again, usual, tack clothing it all down. This is where we'll talk about, in a second, the quality of paint. We really want to only put down 2 coats, because more coats we put down, the more orange peel you're going to get, and also dust, things like dust. So
yeah, which is more prone in your like 3-layer pearls.
No, that's right, yeah, and you don't really want to do that. We'll take a car as an example. If you have to go around 4 times for whatever reason, that's a lot more dust, more orange peel for all those coats that you're having to do.
Yeah, that's right. I can see here you're starting with doing underneath the tank and going around the edges first.
Oh yeah, edges. Oh, look, they are pretty important, even with the repair, spending the time getting that right, sanding it. And yes, spraying the edges is important. Now I normally carry a light of some sort so I can see underneath the tank, well in this case, because there's nothing worse than having to put down the colour and clear and then coming in and seeing a bit of primer because you missed spraying a corner or edge. I guess the equivalent you would say is under a wheel arch or a side skirt. Now I normally don't turn a tank like this, so it really is just for video purposes only, just to show you different angles and just show you application of some of the paint.
Yeah, like a video doesn't really give you feedback on like technique.
Well, that's right. It's not. It can't see you, so it can't suggest things like your distance and speed, even your gun setup, application. I guess that's why it's a trade. So there is theory, yes, but the practice, and this is where if you're in the trade and you've got a good teacher, yeah, they are investing time in you. It's a little bit different when you've got a hobby and you've got a self-interest that you're wanting to play around with it, and it is not cheap paint. It's not cheap.
Yeah,
so,
it comes down to practice.
Oh, yeah, definitely. You can see now that the colour is eggshelled off. It's gone to a satin finish, so waiting about 5 minutes in this case before putting down the second coat. Otherwise, if you're waiting or not waiting long enough, you can find the paint a bit soft, and if it is, there's solvent trap, so that can be problematic when you're coming to put the clear coat down. Sometimes even having a timer, I like to have a stopwatch because you can lose yourself a little bit in the paint job itself, and
yeah,
bit of vortex of time.
It's always good to have a stopwatch.
Yeah. What I will say about spraying metallic, you're not spraying it too heavy, so it is a little bit of a medium, which again we did say a bit of practice and a little bit of feedback goes a long way. But putting the metallic down even enough, because if you're putting it down quite heavy, you're going to get a very mottled effect. You really don't want mottle in it when it comes to metallics, so making a lay nicely, which does bring us into like a half coat or a drop coat. I have found there is often a bit of a language barrier and a crossover of the meanings of half coat and drop coat. So let's put a bit of context into it. What are you referring to? So the half coat or drop coat, are you referring to the color or a clear coat? And in which case, if you're referring to color, the half coat is normally the way that the metallic lays on top like a veil. You're trying to make the metallic look nice and even.
More uniformed.
More uniformed, yeah. So you might even hear people talking about eliminating by cross-hatching or trying to eliminate tiger stripes. but essentially that's it. Whereas sometimes when you're talking about half coat and you're talking in the context of a clear coat, so that's a half coat going on now, it's like a lighter, but you don't want to make it go dry and rough. So there is a bit of knowledge behind that, so it is a different video, but it's making it, as I said, just trying to make it look nice and even. So let's just go back to the clear coat. If you're talking about a half coat, that could be in reference to an adhesion coat, where you're going over an already clear coated surface and it's keyed back, so you're using it as an adhesion coat.
And you said something earlier about muscle memory.
Yeah, so we were joking around before with the tank. You might have seen me prime it blindfolded, because I had painted quite a few of those tanks earlier on in the week, so I knew the curve, the shape. So even when it comes to a project, you hopefully, if you come to the time of clear coating or the color, you would have built up some muscle memory knowing the shape of the tank itself and your spray gun, where it's supposed to start and stop, almost being robotic like and following the consistent distance and speed over, well, in this case, a tank.
Which is really important, especially when it also comes to cars.
Yeah, like your 3-layer pearls and your candies, which we have covered. Now, this tank here, 40 minutes, it has cured off and gone to a nice eggshell finish, ready for the clear coat. Applying the clear coat for some people can often feel a little bit like a make or break situation, where they've just put down the clear coat and haven't got the result that they expected or the result that they wanted, and wonder why. So yes, having the right and appropriate clear coat for your project, and even the right equipment, like the right spray gun or the suitable spray gun for doing your clear coats. I will be putting in the description below what clear coats and what guns I use, so hopefully if you're wanting something to go by, you can use that as a guide. The clear coat. It's exciting. It's always nice when you put the clear coat down. You're like, oh, I nearly finished the project, or nearly finished the job. So it is quite important.
It does show you like it's the final product of all that hard work.
Oh yeah,
comes through with a nice gloss finish.
I'm surprised when I look at the video when I was putting this together. It looks like I'm creating a jelly. I don't know. It looks so bad. It looks like, oh wow, you're just putting so much on there. But in the booth, it didn't look anything like this when you're doing an application. So it can look a little bit overkill on a video, but I guess it's clear, so it can be a bit hard to see.
The camera seems to pick up a lot of the atomization.
Yes, it does. It looks like I'm spraying overspray everywhere, but it's going on quite nicely, hopefully, as you see. And I have got, got a lot of fluid going on there, so I have backed it off because there's a lot of curves of tanks, so you've got to be careful of overlapping too many coats, otherwise you're going to get runs. But hopefully the tank on its own, when you see the final product, you'll have to take my word for it or have a look at it and see what it is. So that was the first coat. Because I'm going straight on the base coat, I could have applied that a little bit heavier, which I did in this case, whereas if you're going to, well, I'll talk about that a little bit later. Oh, look at that. Looks nice when I turn it. You can see my setup for the camera. And then the second coat. You might see me, walking away and checking the camera. Yep, still working. Because there's been a few times when I've press record and the battery's run out or something's gone on and it hasn't recorded. I'm like, oh man. Now there, that little finger going on there, sometimes you can get a scrap piece of metal and spray the same equivalent coat on there and check that rather than your work, but there is masking tape on there, and you can see me now putting the second coat down, which means when I checked up on top it was a bit sticky, like sticky tape, so it's a bit tacky. Although I did cut the video, I believe I cut the video, so you did miss out on a couple of minutes rather than watching me literally paint dry. So you can see again, hopefully the distance and speed of the clear coat going on. It's nicer when you see it on a flat panel, so you can get a more feel of it and have different angles, but hopefully you can pick it up on this way. And again, turning that tank around, getting at a slightly different angle. But yeah, waiting for it to tack off between coats. It'll be wet first, then it'll go slightly stringy, like you'll see it stringing or cobwebbing off your fingers, and then it'll go like tacky, and it won't come off on your fingers. The clear coat won't, it'll be like a little tacky. So I only put 2 coats of clear down on this case because this one had to be sanded back, then striped. I'll put a finished video somewhere along the lines of this aubergine colour and how it turned out. Otherwise we'll go back to the other 2 tanks, which was at the start of the video, which was the black and silver and the black and red. Jared wanted to see it all put together, so here it is, finished.
All that hard work paid off.
Yeah, and when I put the second clip in, when I inserted it, inside the booth versus outside, looks very different.
You can really see the sparkle.
Oh, and even in reality, looks so different to on a video. So going into the pinstriping, on the right here, that's an unsanded clear coat, whereas on the left here we use 1500 grit sandpaper to key it and make it all satin finish or flat finish, so that way the pinstriping has something to stick to, or the fine line. And I'll introduce you to Pete. Here he is, laying down some tape.
Hi, I'm Pete. What I'm doing here is just roughly putting some tape on the tank to get a general feel for how it's going to go. What I've done here is I've put some blue tape on, the one to show the centre line of the tank, and the other longitudinal tape is to show the forward extent of the scallop, so that when you look at the tank it's the same on both sides.
So the orange, we're painting within that, and you can see me just tack clothing now. There's so much tack clothing. You just don't want any dust and dirt, especially at this stage, so constant blowing. And I'm just putting a bit of a adhesion promoter down here that's going up to the edge of the fine line, so that way when you pull the fine line off, you don't pull some of the paint with it, and otherwise it can be a bit of a problem. And then laying down some gold here, because we're using a gold on both of these tanks. In this case, there are two tanks in the booth at the same time, which both had gold pinstriping. Then we're going to be laying a little bit of gold pinstriping over the top of, some fine line tape over the top of the gold, and then masking it off, so that way you can paint the inner side of it silver. And I did just cut it out there. One of the things you'll see in a second, I didn't get a video of me laying down the fine line, so you're following still the same curve of the fine line, but just slightly on the inside of it, and then putting a bit of masking tape between the gap that between the two fine lines, so you probably can't see it. But I decided to insert this video here of me working on the aubergine tank, and you can see me just laying down the orange fine line tape on the inside of the other orange fine line tape, and then covering that gap between the two fine lines to stop any overspray going between it when I come to do the next part. And the purpose of this is to create the gold pinstriping. And you can see here the orange fine line tape on the inside of the other orange fine line tape, and in this next part hopefully you can see the yellow masking tape covering that gap before finally going into some more tack clothing. Anything else to say, Pete?
No, I think that's pretty much it, Nath.
Just, yeah, always putting down just guidelines and things like that, so you know.
It takes practice. I mean, one of the most difficult things in taping these kind of jobs is getting a constant radius in a curve.
And mirroring that to the same on the other side. That's tough going. Yeah, and looking at multiple angles, and you do tend to lose your marbles a little bit.
But just get some tape and a flat sheet and just practice laying a tape line down in different curves and angles. And
you can see us unwrapping it like a Christmas present here. So I've got both videos of the silver and the gold striping and the red candy in a second, which we'll talk about. But yeah, the fine line is fairly flexible, but definitely takes a lot of practice, and often feeling the curve of the panel helps.
Yeah.
I don't really have time to put it into the video here, but that's what we're aiming at here. And we're switching over to the red in a second. So that's mirroring on both sides. They look pretty even to me, Pete. Look nice. And here's the red here. Now we were talking a bit before. This red here is a candy, but we put the candy pigmentation into a binder because we didn't want too much film build.
That's right. Yeah. If we put it in clear, the build would have been too much for the fine line tape to produce a clean edge when we lifted it off.
Or produce too much of a high edge in some of the cases. So putting the candy in binder sometimes is an option, and then putting the clear coat, so that way you can minimise how much clear coat you can see that's going around. Yeah, came together quite nicely, I think.
Thanks, Pete, for joining us.
Okay, no worries, mate.
Well, I'm doing something very dangerous here, is using a bit of wax and grease remover to help identify any blow-throughs, or if there is any blow-throughs. You can use a water-based wax and grease remover, which is normally what I like to use. But in this case, I'm just using it to identify if there is any of the gold or the silver that happened to go through. So there's nothing worse than putting your clear coat on and seeing these little sparkles and you go, oh man. So using a bit of wax and grease remover just to help remove any of that. So, but you do have to be careful because it can damage your paint work, like in this case the base coat. If you touch that, you will remove some of the paint, so you just got to be super careful. Otherwise, here I'm just putting down a little light coat. I put it lighter than when I put the clear coat on the base coat, because I'm going on to sanded clear coat. I just wanting to make that adhere properly, or I guess it's a lighter amount, so that way when I put the second coat of clear on top of that, it bonds a little nicer. Otherwise, you can have things like cratering or things like that. Or
works like an adhesion coat.
Yeah, like it's yeah. Essentially, you're putting down like an adhesion coat over the lot, and then allowing, I think, about 5 minutes. Again, checking to make sure it goes tacky between coats before you put in your second and third coat. I didn't in this case. I don't know why, or maybe I didn't get the video of it. I normally would have put a first coat over the pinstriping or the scallop itself first, just to give another coat of clear, so that way if I have to cut and buff it or take a little bit of that ridge out, I could have. And the same way when I did this silver here, I put a little lighter coat down for an adhesion coat and then put down a further 2 coats. And I didn't see me putting a first coat over my scallop there, but that's normally what I would do. And it would have been nice to have a few of these photos all with all the bikes all put together, but when I was doing this video, none of that had happened. But other than that, I think that's all we need to say. But thanks for joining us. It's been a long project, getting all these things out, or rather the video editing side of it. So it's been a bit of fun, and I probably will end up putting stuff up on Facebook or YouTube or Instagram if I get the photos through of the bike. So in time, they'll be there. Anything else I need to add? Oh yeah, I was going to say things like flow coating, if you hear that term. Once the clear coat's all gone off, that's overnight, so say for instance 24 hours, you can knock it back with a bit of 1500 grit wet and dry, and then again tack cloth it all off and then reapply the clear coat. Some people like to do that, especially if there's a ridge in things like pinstriping. That's a good way of going about it, and saves you cutting and buffing, but there's still that room if you've got enough clear. But you do have to be careful of how many coats are clear, just so
don't want to rub through.
Yeah, you don't want to rub through, and there is limitations of how many coats are clear. But otherwise, thanks for joining us and sticking through with it.
Yeah, make sure it's real glossy.